Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is a series of videos where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. If you're new to my channel, of course this is a booktube channel, but it is a very informal one. My videos are unscripted, they're off the cuff, and I don't really call these reviews, I just call them discussions. It's basically the thoughts I had about the things that I read. And I encourage, basically polite discussion within the comments. So what we have here are two books that are related somewhat thematically and also by coincidence by color. The first thing we have here is A Reenchanted World, The Quest for a New Kinship with Nature by James William Gibson, and we have Paganism for Beginners, The Complete Guide to Nature-Based Spirituality for Every New Seeker by Althaea, Sebastiani. Hopefully I'm saying that right. So I read these for interests which are very similar. So we'll begin with this one. So I have, especially over the last few months, had a deeper interest in, I guess, alternative modes of spirituality, especially things like paganism. I myself, personally, I am atheist, but there are certain pagan practices and pagan perspectives, and especially from an animist perspective, that I do find very compelling. Not coming from a place of belief, but really coming from more of a utilitarian view, how that can maybe transform and be used to better our relationships with the environment, just as one example. One of the things that I would say one pagan path that I really like the rituals for and perspective of is Asatru or Norse paganism, or heathenism. And I had read this one excuse me, I think back in June, and I really like this, and this compelled me to pick up the other paganism book I'll be showing. Related to all that, of course, is this idea that, we basically interact with nature in a way in which we see nature as a place that is sacred. And that's really what this book has to do with. This is a little bit more of a historical / sociological perspective, maybe even a little bit journalistic. And he splits the book up into three parts. The first book is kind of a survey American history of the various ways in which, we're talking mostly Americans, have found a certain kinship with nature, where they basically stop seeing the natural world as a place to extract resources, something to have dominion over, and instead see it as a place which is maybe sacred or spiritual. They see animals as kin, rather than something separate. So he talks about this kind of growing environmentalism that occurred through the 1800s, of course into the 1900s and into the 21st century. This was published in 2009, which the first half of the book you don't really feel the age, or when this was published. The second half of the book you definitely do. But I really like that first third of the book or so. It talks about how people were becoming discontent with modernism. It talks about beautiful landscapes and how that made people want to preserve them, majestic animals. People like looking a whale in the eye for the first time and, basically feeling some kind of connection or seeing that there was a consciousness there, starting to see personhood in nature, in plants and animals, all those sorts of things. And then the middle part of the book, he goes into how things can go wrong. And that can be basically taking this, that first part is really about how we find enchantment in nature, how we can lend nature a certain kind of almost mystical veneer. And then that second half is how sometimes those things can go wrong, how that can be exploited through different capitalist means. He also gets into things like, the conservative religious evangelical right and their rejection of this sort of thing as a paganism. He does in that first part get into a little bit of animism and neo-paganism and people finding connections with nature that way. Once again, connecting to things like this book. And he, goes into all the different ways that things can kind of really go wrong and about how the environment and the culture of enchantment is being threatened. And a lot of that really has to do with the Bush administration. So I said this was published in 2009, so he goes into different things that the Bush administration did to scale back, dismantle in a lot of ways, a lot of environmental protections, very hostility towards the environment. And then at the end, he does get into how things are starting to look up again at that point. A lot of the things that the religious right was trying to do, and he does give some, he does give some word to a sort of, I guess, Christian environmentalism. So that is in here. But a lot of what he talks about is the evangelical hard right, which was very much against this kind of culture of enchantment. But nevertheless, he talks about how things start to get better and start to look up. So again, it's published in 2009. It definitely feels more like there's a long list of, basically things that the government was doing at that time, or in the early 2000s. But overall, I did like this. I really like this cover design, I gotta say. I had come across this book as I was researching books about, connection to nature, and I was just lucky enough to find this in a local used bookstore. So I was really excited to get this, and I'm glad I read it. I really did enjoy this. Again, that the second half, we're already about 15 years beyond the stuff that he was talking about, but that first half I really enjoyed. The whole thing with the enchantment, eco-warriors, and all of that. So, yeah, definitely like this. And then I'm sorry, I didn't even say, I read this in early July. Also in early July, I had finished this. So we got Paganism for Beginners, a complete guide to nature-based spirituality for every new seeker, Althaea Sebastiani. So I wouldn't necessarily call myself a pagan. I am an atheist, which one of my criticisms of this book is that would basically, it seems like, disqualify me from ever considering myself pagan. So you can see my tabs here. I did have some disagreements with this book. However, this is a book that I had seen pretty universally praised by people as an introduction to paganism. And the reason that I wanted to read this was not necessarily for a how-to guide, because this was so well received, and it was a fairly quick read. The print is pretty big in this book. I wanted to get a sense of what the overall consensus was about paganism. Of course, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos and things like that over the last few months, but every YouTube channel has their own spin on things. So I thought this would give me an overall consensus about it. And I guess it did. There were certain things that I think it did well. Okay, it does lay out a lot of various types of paganism. It is not heavily Wicca focused, which is really nice. It does give a lot of, basically page time to different types of paganism. It lays stuff out in a pretty simple way. And it does really encourage the idea that each pagan would basically find their own path. There's no dogma, there's nothing like that. So all that stuff I thought was really good. Now, I said, these tabs recommend that, or suggest they do have some issues. One of them was, we have a serious lack of citing. Not a lot of resources listed. There's a very brief references page, and that's about it. When I read this one the month before, I think there's between 7 to 10 pages just of sources. So this was very well documented. And this one wasn't, and that did kind of get on my nerves at certain times because of certain claims that were being made. For instance, she has a section here about science. Yeah, paganism and science. So we have things like, this is all about magic. But science can neither prove nor disprove that magic is real. There simply isn't enough measurable evidence to make a determination one way or the other. There have been very few studies focusing on uncovering evidence about magic's effectiveness. The few studies that have been done, such as a recent study measuring the effect of energy healing on cancer cells, don't hold up to peer review due to inherent issues with the way the research was conducted. But that's an area where I'd like to see a source. I'd like to know, what study are we talking about? Okay, can I find out more about this? And a lot of what's being said there, because she's also talking about, well, anyway, her claims about magic and science, I kind of feel like a lot of scientists who deal with things like measuring energy might disagree with some of her claims there. Another kind of issue that I have with this is that it is, once again, kind of like the first Heathen book that I had read, not this one. It is very heavily, exclusively, basically polytheist. She says right here, the essential component of paganism is the belief in and worship of deities. Right from the very beginning, the central thing about paganism for her is the worship of deities, not a reverence for nature. And again, this is a complete guide to nature-based spirituality. It's not really nature-based the way that she explains things. Nature worship is a byproduct of having a belief in many gods. You don't become pagan by having reverence for nature and wanting to interact with it. You become pagan by believing in many gods, and then that eventually leads you to nature, the way that this is basically organized. Because she talks about the flow of the seasons. Just another quote that relates to that, page 64 here. In modern times, this concept of basing religious observances on natural cycles can seem out of place, even with paganism's earth-centric approach. Few of us live our lives in such a way that our existence is pulled directly from the land. We buy our food from stores and restaurants, and our clothing is often made on the other side of the world by people we'll never know. I'm totally fine there. Why not base our religious calendars on the gods? Why focus so strongly on the natural world? Even if we did wish to base religious observances solely upon the gods, there is no way to take the gods out of the natural world. They are the movers and shakers, the powers behind natural forces, and many of their stories are intimately tied to the land and natural cycles. Essentially, what she's getting at here is that the reason that paganism is focused on nature is because the gods are behind its natural movings. So because the gods are behind nature, that's why you worship nature, not because nature brought you in at first. So it's what I was disappointed in. With all that to say is this really leaves out a whole fairly sizable group of pagans. She talks about different types of paganism, but in her view, and she does, I will say that she gives a very short attention to pantheism, and how some pantheists might see gods as archetypes. That's as far as it goes. So there's no atheists, there's no non-theist pagans in here. So there's a whole movement called atheopaganism. So that's not there. Humanistic paganism, secular paganism, naturalistic paganism, religious naturalism. All of those types of paganism are generally non-theistic and often atheistic, and yet they don't meet the qualifications of paganism in here. So I felt like this was, even though this was really emphasizing finding your own path, it rejects outright already pre-existing forms of paganism. Not explicitly, but implicitly, by how everything is defined in here. And there were just certain things. This is interesting. She has a page, Satan, a social misconception, and she talks about how, it's a misconception from Christians that pagans worship Satan. Satan is not at all compatible with paganism, although that's not entirely true. She does admit that, many pagans are also witches. They don't have to be, but, there are certainly types of witchcraft that, people are both witches and pagans, and that includes traditional witchcraft. And from my understanding, and I'm still new at studying this sort of thing, not practicing it, just studying it as kind of like a armchair, sort of academic approach to these things, just because I find it all fascinating. There are a lot of traditional witches that do incorporate the devil. Sometimes it's seen as like the horn god, or the witch father, or the green man. There's different things that they might interpret it as, but oftentimes the devil is included in some of that witchcraft practice. So it's not entirely true to say that the devil plays no part in paganism. So this seems like it's at once trying to cast a very wide net and make paganism seem very, very accepting and very inviting, but at the same time it ends up maybe having some misconceptions with the devil thing, with the science thing. It also seems to be a little bit limiting in a lot of ways, especially by discounting non-theistic forms of paganism. I know that all the praise that I've seen from this really seems to be from people who are already polytheistic. Remember that, as I said in the beginning of this video, I don't really call my discussion or these videos reviews. I'm not necessarily reviewing this. I am talking about the way that I personally, as a reader, interacted with a book like this. And you have to understand that I am an atheist, and I am interested in various forms of paganism. But I, from my own perspective as a reader, found this, a little bit wanting in some areas. So anyhow, it's okay. If you are already a polytheist, I think that, and you're interested in paganism, you've never read a book about it before, I think this is probably a really good place to start. But for me, obviously, I had some issues. So anyhow, these are two books that I read related, at least in my mind they are. So we've got A Reenchanted World, and we've got Paganism for Beginners. If you've read any of these, or if you have any thoughts about them that you'd like to respectfully share and engage in conversation, love to hear from you. As always, thank you, BookTube.